Hi there, my name is Travis Brace. I'm a doctoral intern at Iowa State University Student Counseling Services. Today this video is going to be on how to maintain healthy relationships. It's going to cover a variety of topics, and we're going to be talking about this in relation to romantic relationships. However, a lot of these topics and skills are going to be applicable to family relationships, friendships, and even work relationships. Some of the things that we're going to specifically cover are emotion-focused communication, the components particularly that make emotion-focused communication effective and creating a healthy communication pathway between you and the other person. We'll go through some practice about how to apply emotion-focused communication based on real scenarios in your life, and then plan for future ones using hypothetical scenarios. We'll also cover what boundaries are. We'll talk about their different types and different levels. We'll also talk about how to set boundaries with others and how to hopefully maintain them. We'll also cover conflict resolution. We'll start off with talking about why conflict happens and what its purpose is. We'll also talk about different conflict resolution skills using a lot of the topics that we'll already cover in the emotion-focused communication section and the boundary section. And we'll also talk about different ways to prepare for conflict resolution, whether you have a conflict that's on the horizon or if you're just trying to plan for one in the future that might come up. We'll also explore how to maintain relationships over a long term, and we'll explore the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, which were developed by the Gottmans, who are the experts of couples therapy, and we'll talk about the different antidotes to address the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Lastly, we'll review some resources, a variety of different podcasts, books, videos that you can access to expand upon some of the information here, or that you can add to your skill base and really learn some more skills about maintaining relationships. One of the things I want to note is that some things that are outside of the scope of this video are interpersonal and domestic violence, or IPV and DV. We won't be covering anything about developing awareness of DV, stalking, or other types of IPV. We won't be able to talk about any managing of safety in relationships of IPV or DV, and we won't really be covering any resources for IPV or DV. What I encourage, if you are seeking those types of resources, I encourage you to seek out our SCS Skills Corner video on domestic violence resources from a former intern, Caitlin Stumpner, that's also on our YouTube page. Or I recommend reaching out to Student Counseling Services for an initial appointment or for a consultation to get access to those resources or to get support as you navigate any of those types of challenges that you're experiencing or maybe that you know somebody is experiencing. Before we get started today, I think it's really important that we talk about mindfulness. Not only because it's a really great coping skill for distress, but also because it can be really helpful for if you're having a conflict with your partner, a family member, or a friend. It can really be helpful for allowing you to practice really effective emotion-focused communication, and for applying a lot of the conflict resolution skills we'll be covering in this video. The purpose of mindfulness generally is developing more awareness of what's going on internally within us and what's going on in our external experience, or the things that are going on around us. How to practice mindfulness, we oftentimes think of it as meditation. However, it's oftentimes a lot more than that. How we'll practice it today is one of the more basic forms, and that's paced breathing. And what this kind of mindfulness practice will involve is obviously breathing, assessing what's going on inside your body, going on and noticing the things or assessing the things that are going on around you. And we'll also be closing our eyes so that we have less distractions that are pulling us away from just noticing the things that are going on inside of us or around us. And what mindfulness can do is it actually activates our parasympathetic nervous system, which helps our body, is part of our nervous system that helps our body calm down and come down from feelings of distress or from feeling activated. What this involves is we're going to breathe in through our nose for 4 seconds. And as you breathe in, you're going to notice that your stomach is going to be the first thing to expand, and then your chest is going to expand last. What's happening is you're filling up all of the air and placing it in close to your diaphragm, which is leading your stomach to expand. And then over time, as that oxygen builds up in your lungs at the very top of them, they expand, and that leads to your chest expanding. This is a deep, full breath, and this helps with activating that parasympathetic nervous system. And then as you breathe out, you're going to reverse that process. You're going to breathe out through your mouth and let the air out of your chest first, and then the air out of your stomach last. So by the time you get to that 5 count, you should notice your stomach's pretty much retracted in from where it started. You want to also make sure that you're not tensing any parts of your body. You want to be sitting or laying down in a place that's as relaxed as possible. That might be both your feet on the floor, your hands in your lap, or maybe on your desk, on the table sitting next to you, or if you're in your bed or laying down somewhere, your arms at your side. You want to try to let your shoulders release if you're somebody who tends to hold a lot of stress in your shoulders. Just allow those to release and be as relaxed as possible in your posture. And as we go through this, I'll guide you through the counting, so you won't even have to worry about how long we're doing this or when to breathe in and breathe out. I'll be guiding you through that. All you have to do is try to keep going with my count. If you get off base, that's all right. Just try to maintain going with that count and practice the breathing. If you notice anything coming up inside of you or externally around you, sounds, smells, anything that might feel like it's pulling you away from the moment, just notice it and allow it to pass. I'll give you a moment to find a place that is relaxed for you. Okay. Hopefully you found a place and a position that's relaxed for you. And we're going to start with breathing in through our nose for 4 seconds. So breathing in, 1, 2, 3, 4. Breathing out, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Breathe in, 1, 2, 3, 4. Breathe out, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Breathe in, 1, 2, 3, 4. Breathe out, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Breathe in, 1, 2, 3, 4. Breathe out, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Breathe in, 1, 2, 3, 4. Breathe out, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Breathe in, 1, 2, 3, 4. Breathe out, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Breathe in, 1, 2, 3, 4. Breathe out, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Breathe in. 1, 2, 3, 4. Breathe out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Breathe in. 1, 2, 3, 4. Breathe out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Breathe in. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Breathe in. 1, 2, 3, 4. Breathe out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Breathe in. 1, 2, 3, 4. Breathe out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Breathe in. 1, 2, 3, 4. Breathe out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Breathe in. 1, 2, 3, 4. Breathe out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, we'll wrap up there. We did that for 3 minutes. What I encourage is practice that 3 to 5 minutes, a daily, every other day, a few times per week. The more you develop this skill, the more easily you'll be able to practice it, and the more effective it'll be over time to help you manage distress in the moment. So let's go ahead and get started and start talking about some of these core components to maintaining healthy relationships. Let's start with emotion-focused communication, starting with what is it? Before we can fully understand emotion-focused communication and conflict resolution for that matter, we got to break down the emotion-focused communication into the two parts, emotions and communication. So emotion is information from our cognitive and physiological reactions to our environment. Emotions are simply data points. They're neither wrong nor right. They're just data points on a graph of our lives. They simply are telling us information about our experiences and the environment, and maybe what's going on between us and another person. The meaning that we ascribe to emotions or our actions from emotions can be both helpful or unhelpful for us. However, the emotions themselves are neither wrong nor right. And just so you know, it's generally accepted that there are 6 universal emotions among humanity: sadness, anger, fear, happiness or joy, and disgust and surprise. You can see those kind of in the center of this emotion wheel over here. Oftentimes people will have similar reactions to shared experiences, such as disgust towards someone harming another person, or joy from looking at small fuzzy animals. However, there are people who have emotional reactions to experiences that seem very different than our own. Particularly, this happens for people with trauma. A classic example of this might be somebody who is feeling really sad and may experience fear when somebody attempts to console them by hugging them, because that person, the person who's experienced trauma, maybe was physically abused in the past. So even though the hug might be there to comfort them in their sadness, they're interpreting it as a signal that they might be harmed because of their past experiences. Again, their emotional reaction, or this type of emotional reaction, it isn't wrong, and it's not necessarily right either. It's just simply a way that they've developed in their brain and their body to protect themselves in interactions with others based on their past experiences. And it's important to note that this could end up eventually getting to a point where they're no longer in that dangerous environment anymore, and it's maybe creating distance between themselves and others, such as with maybe a romantic partner during the dating experience. Also, another way that sometimes emotions can be inconsistent or consistent with the universal human experience is the intensity. So sometimes maybe the intensity of the emotion is maybe too high or too low in a sense compared to what's actually going on. Again, that's okay. That's not wrong or right. It's maybe just something that to be aware of and to learn how to manage in those moments, to maybe decrease the emotion so it's less distressing, or to learn how to increase the emotion so you feel more activated, more capable of doing what you need to do. Lastly, an important thing about emotions is that they're really necessary for making decisions. As I previously mentioned, they're data points about our experience, and those data points can be used to make decisions about what we're going to do in the future. If we only made decisions using our rational or logical mind, then we might not be able to account for the harm our decisions may have on others, or to account for other experiences that our emotions are more privy to. Similarly, if we only made decisions using our emotional mind, then we might be making decisions on impulse frequently to meet our own needs, and maybe that might lead us to neglect others or neglect other needs that we have. For example, if we're making only emotional decisions, we might choose to eat out all the time because we decide that, oh, that makes us happy. When we know that that's maybe not necessarily good, and that's where the logical mind comes in, because maybe we're not eating food that's fulfilling all of our needs, or maybe we're spending too much money, or maybe it's distracting us from other important parts of our life. So it's just, emotions are very important to our decision-making process, but they're only a piece of it. So that second part of emotion-focused communication is communication. Communication oftentimes is thought of as simply as verbal, but it can also be nonverbal, particularly body language. As humans, we've developed a pretty sophisticated and unique strategy for our communication, and it involves both of these. Common nonverbal communication can look like crossing our arms when we're angry because we're maybe indicating out to others that, hey, stay away, I'm feeling mad, or I'm feeling hurt and I need space right now. Or maybe it's our way of communicating that actually we need a hug. Maybe we need somebody to provide us with support or comfort. Another example might be when somebody is feeling really restless, but you can't necessarily notice it just based on what they're saying. But you notice that their eye contact is kind of moving around a lot. Maybe that their legs are bouncing a lot. So maybe you're seeing that, and maybe that's tipping you off to something about them. Maybe they're feeling uncomfortable. Maybe they're anxious. Maybe they're trying to communicate that I need some comfort so that I feel less uncomfortable, or I need some way to decrease my anxiety. It's really important to just remember that communication is a complex behavior from our decision-making network. Hint, hint, that includes emotions. And emotions aren't the only thing that informs our communication. Our values are important to our communication, past experiences, our needs, and a variety of other resources of our experience and who we are. Building off of, now that we know the components of emotion-focused communication, let's talk about it as a whole. So really, emotion-focused communication is the practice of being attuned, that is, listening to our emotions, so that we can make decisions about how we want to communicate to others or maybe to ourselves. And It involves a variety of different factors about our present experience, and this is where mindfulness that I alluded to earlier is really important, because mindfulness can help us tell us about our present experience. It can tell us what's going on in our environment around us that might be impacting us emotionally. It can tell us if we're feeling safe or uncomfortable in an environment. It can also be informed by our senses and physiological reactions, such as tenseness in our chest when we feel uncomfortable in an environment. It can also be informed by other people or animals or other things that are in our environment that are causing us to react in some way. One way to think about this emotion-focused communication and the networks that inform it is to use the hot cross bun. As you can see here in the upper left portion of the video, hot cross bun is a popular pastry in Great Britain and the countries it has colonized throughout history. The hot cross bun model has been adapted to demonstrate the network that's involved in our decision-making and communication process, and just better understanding what's going on for us. It's very popular in cognitive behavioral therapy, and it helps us gain insight into the different ways that our experiences are influencing each other and causing us to engage in certain behaviors, or maybe not engage in behaviors that we're hoping to engage in. It's important to note that some people maybe tend to rely on or are more focused on one or two of these networks. Maybe you're somebody who is more privy to your thoughts and your emotions or feelings. Or maybe you're somebody who notices your physical symptoms more and your behaviors, but you don't notice your thoughts and emotions. Again, much like with emotions, there's no problem with necessarily picking up on one more than the other. It's just important to pick up on the ones that aren't telling you about your experience and trying to better understand what they're telling you about what's going on. And what I encourage you to do is think about which areas you tend to focus on more frequently. It might help to think about the last distressing experience you had with another person. What areas did you notice more quickly? Perhaps it was in an argument and you remember feeling hot and annoyed, suggesting that you tend to notice your sensations, the hotness in your body, that physical symptom, and your emotions more, the annoyed feeling. Or perhaps you noticed that you turned away from the other person and had a thought like, I can't believe they said that, suggesting that you notice your behaviors and your thoughts more easily. Another example might be using the one I just provided, is when somebody crosses our boundaries in a relationship. We might become annoyed or hurt. We might, again, turn away from that person as a way to establish that boundary again in a physical way. Maybe we notice feeling hot, or maybe we feel some nausea in our stomach. Again, maybe we have that thought of, I can't believe they just did that. They crossed that boundary. Again, this is just an example, but emotion-focused communication is built off of understanding this network so that you then can use this network to inform how to respond to others and let them know what's going on for you so that they better understand and so that you can set boundaries with them or work with them to resolve conflicts. So, emotion-focused communication is identifying and communicating your experience to others. A lot of what we've talked about in the last few slides. Identifying your needs based on your experience as well. Using that example from before with crossed boundaries, maybe your need was to have them apologize for crossing that boundary. And then it's asserting that need to others. And the process of both identifying what you're feeling and experiencing in the moment and what you need also involves using I feel and or I need statements. We'll review a few examples here on this slide. So some examples might be saying, I felt hurt when you didn't respond to my text about going out tonight. I was worried you didn't want to spend time with me. I need to know that you want to spend time with me. This might be something that somebody might say and use for emotion-focused communication to communicate how maybe a partner or a good friend led them to feel after not responding to a text that maybe that person had sent to them. And it also asserts that need to be seen and to know that that friend or that partner wants to spend time with them. Another example might be, I feel loved when you make space for me to vent about school. This might seem kind of funny to have this one on here after just going through so many experiences that some might describe as negative or hurtful, but I think it's important to describe also the positive experiences of using emotion-focused communication. Saying, I feel loved when you make space and time for me to vent about school, lets somebody know how they feel when that person is fulfilling their need. That need to maybe vent about just a stressful experience from school. So emotion-focused communication has a variety of different uses, both to assert our needs and to let others know when our needs are being met and how much we appreciate them, which can be really helpful to maintaining a healthy relationship. So let's try to get some practice with this. Using, again, our hot cross bun example here, and we're going to go through a variety of different strategies for using past experiences on this slide to then prepare for hypothetical experiences in the future so that you can practice and apply emotion-focused communication in both those past experiences so you feel more prepared to practice them in the hypotheticals, and then practicing the hypotheticals so that you feel more ready for when they do or when they might come up in the future. So, as we're going through this exercise, I'm going to ask you to write down a few things that it might help to pause the video at certain times and give yourself a moment to think. What you're going to want to do is, using a pen and paper, you're going to write about a recent stressful experience you had with someone, i.e., usually a conflict is what we're talking about here. It could be a friend, a partner, a family member, or even a coworker. If you need to pause the video again at any time to think about a recent scenario, go ahead and do so. After you've taken a moment to write down this recent scenario, draw out the hot cross bun network shown here and identify the physical symptoms, emotions, thoughts, and/or behaviors you remember experiencing during that conflict. If you can only remember the one or two of your perceptions in that network, that's okay, because any little detail is going to help. Use the hot cross bun network to identify your emotions and feelings and needs during this conflict. Once you've drawn out your hot cross bun network with your perceptions of this experience written under their respective categories, now jot down how you verbally or non-verbally responded to this person during the conflict. Maybe you remember crossing your arms and becoming silent. Or maybe you remember saying something sarcastic or simply walking away from the conversation. It's important to write these things down so that you understand kind of the outcomes from this perception network, which is essentially a decision-making network. This way you can better understand what you did in that moment, so you can better prepare and plan for how to maybe change that in the future if you're wanting to change it. Next, you're going to want to write down what you remember the other person's responses or reactions were to your actions. Just like with yourself, try to record any verbal or nonverbal reactions you noticed from the other person. If you crossed your arms and became silent, did you notice them talking louder or just saying whatever and walking away? Did you notice that they started to look confused with their eyes? moving side to side. Whatever you can recall from the reaction, just jot it down. Finally, write down what you think was effective or ineffective about your verbal and nonverbal actions during the stressful interpersonal experience. You want to try to focus on what was effective and ineffective about your actions, because these are the only parts of the communication you have control over. The other person may have said or did something that was ineffective or hurtful, and we can only control your own reactions or assertions of your needs to what they've done. We can't control what they are saying or doing. On the next slide, we'll do the same practice with the same experience, but we'll explore it as a hypothetical future conflict and identify changes in your responses that you might use to communicate your emotions and needs to the other person. Okay, so let's take the opportunity to practice some changes that you might make in your verbal and nonverbal responses to this conflict that you might have again in the future or might be planning to have soon with this partner or friend, coworker, etc. And hopefully this will then lead into talking about how to resolve that conflict later on in the presentation. Let's start with writing down a list of responses I'll try to avoid in the similar future conflicts. For example, maybe you found yourself becoming silent and turning away from the other person, and you want to avoid doing that because maybe you noticed that it coincided with the other person talking louder, yelling, or maybe they left the room. It can be helpful to write these responses down as if-then statements. If-then statements are examples of a behavior planning technique called implementation intentions. Research demonstrates that we increase the likelihood that we will apply or avoid certain behaviors if we plan for them by writing down implementation intentions as if-then statements. For example, it could look like, if I notice myself criticizing my partner for not being there for me, then I'll ask for a timeout to allow myself to cool down so I can avoid continuing to criticize them. Another example might be, did you yell at and criticize them for not being there for you when you needed them? Did this result in them shutting down or becoming defensive and responding with anger or criticism towards you? What we want to talk about doing is, what would you change about your response to hopefully change or influence their response? As we talked about before, we can't control their response, but we could influence maybe how they respond. Similarly, let's take a moment to create a list of responses that I'll try to use in similar future conflicts. Again, it might help to write these down as if-then statements to help you remember them during future conflicts. Go ahead and take a moment to write those down, pause the video if that might help you take some time. I do want to point out that some of the responses we want to avoid or use more during one conflict might not be applicable in other conflicts. For example, walking away from a conflict might not be effective at work with a coworker, but it could be effective in a conflict with somebody who has a history of not respecting your physical or emotional boundaries. Lastly, using more of our emotion-focused communication skills, record any of your I feel or I need statements that you may want to use to communicate your emotions and needs to other people during a similar future conflicts. You might notice that these I feel and I need statements are going to be easily built off of the avoid and implement list here. You might notice that you're going to try to say, instead of saying, you make me feel, you're going to say, I feel when this happened. So I felt hurt when you didn't respond to that text, using the example earlier. Just describing specifically how you felt and specifically what happened, not adding any additional details to it. And then talking about the implement list, it might be asserting that need. I'm going to implement saying, I need you to let me know that you want to spend time with me. I need you to respond to text when I'm asking to go out somewhere that same day. One of the key things here is you want to avoid using you statements. You made me feel, or you don't make me feel like my needs are met. The reason for this, and we'll get into this a little bit more in the future in this video, is you statements prompt people to become defensive because they feel blamed or called out. We'll get into more about why that happens, but when we get there, we'll dive a little deeper. For right now, we're going to take a moment and transition to a different topic. Let's talk about boundaries. So boundaries are an important part of emotion-focused communication. And we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about emotion-focused communication again when we get to conflict resolution and the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse in relationships for relationship longevity. So we're going to but right now we're going to distance ourselves from it just a little bit to get into what boundaries are. This might be a newer concept for some people because it isn't often talked about maybe among our parents or in our families growing up. However, boundaries are really important. What they do is they are our limits on what we are comfortable with during interactions with others and with our own actions, ourselves. Boundaries with others help them learn more about what we are comfortable with, how we prefer to be treated, and generally our interaction style. Boundaries with ourselves help us better understand what helps us feel comfortable and uncomfortable with our own behavior as well, and sometimes with others. For example, boundaries might look like, I'm okay with people hugging me when I'm sad or happy. This tells other people that this person is comfortable with hugging when they are sad or happy. As you might notice, there's some emotion-focused communication sprinkled in there. This boundary may have formed because they learned from experience as a child that hugs helped them feel less alone and more supported when they felt sad, or it increased their feelings of happiness in the moment. Self-boundaries might look like, I feel respectful of myself when I don't pressure others to make a decision. When you pressure someone to make a decision or push them in a certain direction, you may feel frustrated with yourself or disappointed in yourself because maybe you crossed your own boundary. Generally, boundaries can be emotional, behavioral, or psychological. There's some other types that we'll get into just in a moment here, but those are kind of the 3 broad categories. Furthermore, boundaries exist on a spectrum, from porous to effective to rigid. Porous boundaries might look like someone who shares vulnerable emotions or experiences and details about experiences with others, regardless of the situation they're in, such as with family, work, school. This can lead people to feel uncomfortable or disconnected from that other person who's talking about these vulnerable experiences because of their own reactions to the information shared. Maybe that person's talking about a traumatic experience that has some very painful topics or experiences in there, and maybe that's triggering for the person who's hearing it. Maybe they experience similar types of trauma and they don't feel comfortable with talking about those similar experiences yet. And that can lead them to feel disconnected. They might experience dissociation. They might feel excessive fear. So this is why porous boundaries can sometimes be unhelpful for not only that person who is maybe experiencing more fear or feeling disconnected, but even for the person who then was sharing all that experience, because all of a sudden they might not notice it, but they're creating or they're leading to disconnection with this other person. Rigid boundaries might look like not expressing emotions to others, which could result in them struggling to understand your experience if you're trying to connect to them. So, for example, a rigid boundary might be like not sharing a lot of information about what you did this past weekend with a close friend. Maybe a close friend's like, hey, what were you up to this weekend? I couldn't reach you. I didn't understand what was going on. We reached out to see if you wanted to hang out. And maybe you're just like, oh, I was just at home just doing some homework. And maybe they asked for more details. They tried to better understand what you were working on, what was going on, if you did anything quote unquote fun over the weekend, and you're just not giving them anything. That rigid boundary might be creating disconnection as well with that other person. And maybe they don't understand what was actually going on for you. Maybe you were feeling really frustrated with yourself because you were procrastinating on this homework assignment. Maybe you were doing something entirely different and you're worried about how they might judge you. Sometimes these different levels on the boundary spectrum are more effective depending on the situation, though. For example, someone may have more rigid boundaries with their family because of past experiences with their family members that have criticized them, harmed them, or not respected them in the past. And maybe that rigid boundary needs to be there right now. Some of the other types of specific boundaries are physical, sexual, financial, time, expectation boundaries, emotional, and intellectual boundaries. There's all sorts of descriptions and examples here on this infographic. However, some other things that you might consider, for example, physical, could be how much touch you're comfortable with, when and where. Sexual is what you're comfortable and not comfortable with during any type of sexual experience. Financial might be how finances are decided upon and how money is split up in the relationship. Time could be how you prefer to spend your time with each other, on your own. Expectations could be just how to split up chores or responsibilities in the relationship. Can also be related to time as well. I'll be ready by this time, for example. Emotional, when you're available for emotional conversations or support, and what type of emotion topics you're comfortable with providing support with at the moment. Intellectual might be what views are you open to discussing and which ones are a no-go for you. It's not something you're willing to talk to them about. How much you can be discussed about those certain topics. And maybe when you need to call a timeout because you've reached that boundary of, okay, we can no longer talk about this. We're too deep into this intellectual conversation. A great example of this is politics, maybe with family, if you have differences in political views. So here's a variety of infographics. For the first one here on the left side from Nidra Tawwab, who is a counselor who's very popular. She's has an Instagram page with a lot of great resources at Nidra Tawwab, or you can also watch some of her Red Table talks and other videos that she has out there that she's really great. Her specialty is talking about boundaries. She provides a lot of different examples here of what boundaries might look like in old relationships and what maybe you can strive for in new relationships. It's important to remember that it takes time and practice. It takes time, practice, mistakes, and difficult conversations to become skillful with setting boundaries. So even though you might have a lot of resources here or find resources from other areas to learn how to set and maintain boundaries, it's a really hard and challenging process. and it'll be rewarding the more you practice it. One of the best ways to start developing the skill is to practice it with yourself first, especially if you're planning on trying to establish boundaries with an old relationship. Because establishing a boundary with an old relationship can be anxiety-provoking or a very stressful process, because it might be very new for the other person. They might be surprised that all of a sudden you're establishing these very different boundaries that led to differences in their expectations. They didn't think that you had a boundary like this. Maybe it's because you had porous boundaries with that person. And maybe they're becoming angry, confused, and maybe criticizing you in some ways. It's important to use the emotion-focused communication skills to say why the emotions or experiences that you're having that are leading you to need to set that new boundary or reaffirm a boundary in that relationship. One of the best ways to think about this is like exposure therapy, which is something we oftentimes use for people with phobias, such as fears of spiders or fears of going outside or being in wider open spaces. Exposure therapy is the practice of exposing yourself to a thing or an experience that provokes your stress or fear. However, we don't just place a spider on the person's hand and say, okay, adjust to the fear. We take time and we build to it slowly, like we want to do with boundaries. Instead, we start with something that provokes a little distress or fear, enough that you feel uncomfortable, but not so much that you start shutting down or that you become overly distressed, and that maybe you have a panic attack. As you become comfortable with this new experience, such as maybe placing a spider on your hand, if you have arachnophobia, we then move them up to the next most distressing scenario involving their phobia. So maybe after setting a spider on their hand, maybe it's then letting the spider be on their hand for a minute as opposed to just a few seconds. In the case of interpersonal communication, it can be a similar idea. It's like practicing a speech for a class even. Start with writing down what your boundaries are by each type of person involved. Your friend, your partner, your family member. This way you know exactly who you're trying to communicate and what you are trying to communicate to that person. Then write down a script of you asserting your feelings and your emotions, and then your needs for that boundary with that person, as if you're having a conversation with them. This way you have a general idea of what, why, and how you want to communicate a boundary to that person. Next, you could practice saying it out loud to a mirror or record yourself saying it and listening back to the recording. This verbal practice can give you practice and some time to reflect on whether you want to change anything about what you're saying to them or how to say it to them. The what and how can be important to decrease the likelihood of defensiveness from the other person, and it can decrease potentially the distressing parts of that experience of communication with them. Lastly, practice it with another trusted person so that you can feel even more comfortable and get additional feedback from somebody so that they can maybe let you know when maybe something sounds like it might make somebody feel a little hurt or uncomfortable or become angry. This way you can continue to workshop it and just gain that experience and that comfort, increased comfort or decreased discomfort, so that you feel more ready practicing it with the person who you're trying to set that boundary with. Lastly, I want to just review the power and control wheel. The power and control wheel provides signs of power and control you might be experiencing in relationships. So what happens sometimes with setting new boundaries or setting boundaries with people is sometimes they might engage in different types of behaviors to create more control or power in that relationship for themselves to maintain their own safety or to focus on getting their needs met, which can oftentimes come at the cost of your own safety or your own health. I encourage you just to review this power and control wheel and just reflect on anything that you might notice in your own relationships currently or in the past. And this, if you do notice anything, I encourage you to then maybe check out the SCS Skills Corner video on domestic violence resources from Caitlin Stumpner that I referenced in the beginning of the video, or I encourage you to reach out to student counseling services for an initial appointment or for consultation. So let's get into conflict resolution. Before we get into conflict resolution specifically, Dr. John Gottman and Julie Gottman, the experts in couples therapy, really make a point that in order to have effective conflict resolution experiences and effective communication, we need to have trust and commitment, share fondness and admiration, turn towards each other or be attuned to each other, and have a positive perspective of each other. Essentially, we need to have this strong, sound foundation for a house, the house being the relationship, so that we can then have effective conflict with each other. We can achieve our dreams and our goals in that that we have for that relationship, so we can create shared meaning and experiences with that other person. So, conflict isn't inherently a bad experience. Oftentimes we think of it that way because of our past experiences. However, it can also bring people closer together and help someone have their needs heard and or met, or it might result in the end of an unhealthy relationship or a relationship that's no longer serving one or both people in it. The goal of conflict is simply starting with opening a communication pathway between you and the other person. Essentially, so you can build a bridge and understand each other and how you're both experiencing the issue at hand or the issues. The goal can also be to address your health, the other person's health, or the health of future relationships. Furthermore, it can help build people's awareness of the other person's values and perspectives. For example, maybe you might approach somebody and say, hey, there's a problem and I'm wondering if we can talk about it. That's a way to maybe tip them off to maybe they crossed a boundary that they weren't aware of that they crossed. Or maybe they're just noticing that something's off in the relationship and they don't know what, and it's leading them to maybe feel uncertain or anxious. So they say, I think something is in our relationship is wrong right now for me. I'm not sure what, but I'm wondering if we could talk about it. This way the other person can recognize that maybe they didn't notice anything was off, but you did, and they can better understand the different experiences or perceptions that are leading you to see that there's something wrong in the relationship, even though there might not actually be something there. It can also help you let other people know about your needs or concerns, especially when they think everything is going just fine. It can be a sign to yourself that there's something wrong in the relationship. As previously mentioned, another goal can be to let somebody else know that they crossed your boundary, which helps you assert that boundary and might help them be more aware of it in the future. Arguably, the most common goal can be to address unresolved pain for one or both people in the relationship. The intent to either begin repairing the hurt or prevent future hurts. So, conflict resolution is a very challenging experience for a lot of people because we oftentimes don't get a great practice with it growing up. Maybe we just didn't experience it a lot or didn't have great role models for it growing up. A common challenge for people is that they don't address a conflict with their partner or family or friend because they are worried about the possible impact on the relationship because of those misconceptions we have about conflict. And it can lead to continuation of hurt feelings. Or they become overwhelmed in other areas of their life, and they can put it off until a better time arrives so that they can address it with that person when they're feeling like everything's better. Unfortunately, this intentional or unintentional avoidance can plant the seeds for what the Gottmans call the four horsemen of the apocalypse. I won't go into all of the research that informs the four horsemen of the apocalypse, but the Gottmans have done a lot of research with couples therapy and with couples, and they've found that there's these four specific experiences that lead to the dissolution or the end of a lot of romantic relationships. We're going to go into these a little deeper in the future, but the four are contempt, criticism, defensiveness, and stonewalling. We'll do a deeper dive on these, but let's just stick to their basic definitions right now. So criticism is attacking the character of someone, and usually it's when we say like, why can't you do this right, or what's wrong with you? Criticism can easily turn into contempt, which, as you can see here, has been found to be the single greatest predictor of divorce or the end of a relationship. Contempt takes criticism a bit further and identifies the person who's being attacked as a specific type of unwanted trait or type of character flaw. As you can see here, you're disgusting, you're stupid. Defensiveness is a self-protection technique that people oftentimes use in reaction to criticism or contempt, and it's in retaliation to ward off that criticism. Because essentially what the person is saying that, hey, I see that there's a problem with me, but I don't like that you're shining this spotlight on it and calling me out for it so harshly. That means the problem isn't me, it's you. There's something wrong with you. That's why you're calling this out. I don't have a problem with what's going on for me. And lastly, we have stonewalling. Stonewalling is when we withdraw from an interaction or shut down. We turn away from them. We don't respond. We walk out or run away out of the room to get away from the distress or the conflict. Or we might even say like, whatever, I don't need this, and then just stay in the room but not respond until the other person maybe leaves. It's a disengaging technique to manage our own emotions, however it leads to disconnection with the person we're talking to. Lastly, for conflict resolution, we want to avoid words and phrases that convey absolutes or all or nothing messages to others, such as never, always, all of the time. These words and phrases often accompany criticism, increase feelings of shame, evoke defensiveness from others, or lead to people shutting down or stonewalling. Furthermore, these words and phrases do not leave much room for compromise alternatives. As they sound, they're absolute. In fact, they often shut down further conversation. So for conflict resolution, we want to use our emotion-focused communication skills, and we want to plan for ourselves first. Establish your needs, your goals, your feelings and emotions that you're experiencing. Reflect on the type and level of the relationship. Is this a romantic relationship, a friendship, a family relationship? Because that might let you know too about how to navigate asserting your needs or emotions with that person. Reflect on your emotional, intellectual, and safety needs. Are you needing to just feel relief? Are you needing validation from that person? Do you need them to not manipulate you or physically harm you? Do you need timeouts? We'll talk about that in a moment about what a timeout could look like, but do you need a moment in a conflict where you kind of both cool down for a moment and come to a place where you feel like you can engage that feels more relaxed, or at least less amped up and distressing? We want to manage our expectations. We don't want to have too high of expectations that maybe everything's going to be resolved. There's going to be no longer problems in our relationship with them that could be unrealistic or unattainable. Or we could have too low of expectations because maybe we have lower self-respect or self-esteem and we're not used to having our needs met. So we don't want to have them too low because we might not actually effectively communicate our emotions and needs to that other person and might not then meet our goals or expectations. Also, recognize any potential obstacles or cost and how will you cope with them. For example, if it doesn't go as planned, if maybe it leads to the end of the relationship, what's your plan for coping afterwards? What are you going to do to comfort yourself, to seek support maybe from others? And lastly, practice, practice, practice. Practice the emotion-focused communication portions from the beginning of this presentation so that you can really get down what you're trying to communicate to the other person. Then also plan for the relationship. Especially if it is a person close to you. In preparation, ask yourself, what do you need during the conflict to be assertive and direct? For example, if you are worried about maintaining your boundaries with this person during the conflict, do you need practice with asserting that boundary and being direct? Do you notice that you tend to maybe fluff things up and kind of try to provide them in a very compassionate way? However, then sometimes your message gets lost in that communication. Also, go ask the person for a day and time that works to talk about the thing that you're concerned about. No one likes to have an unexpected confrontation or conflict. It becomes very distressing, unexpected, it's confusing. This is part of what we call the gentle startup. The gentle startup helps decrease the likelihood that the other person will respond with anger, defensiveness, or confusion. It doesn't remove the possibility, but it decreases the likelihood. And explain the reason for the conversation in a way that is transparent as possible. Consider how the person deals with uncertainty and your own needs if you know them well enough. Perhaps you know that if you are vague about the reason that you're bringing this up, they might be more anxious about the conversation and come into the conflict in an alarmed or aroused state, which could be unhelpful for the confrontation. Or maybe you know that it's a common issue in the relationship that has come up in a different way. So you could tell them that's something that has come up before, but in a different way, so we don't need to talk about it now, we can talk about it later. Also, sometimes it can be really important to identify a safe place for conflicts and confrontations. For some issues or relationships, this won't be hard. In others, you might want to put more consideration into what you need in that space to ensure that you remove yourself from the space as needed to create that safety that we talked about for yourself in the plan on the previous slide. So getting to the action piece, asking to set a timeout. Sometimes funny timeouts are very effective to lighten the mood and even maintain connection during a conflict. If the other person doesn't understand why a timeout is needed, it can be helpful to explain the reason for the timeout. Try to make it focused on your own needs, not things you have observed in them, which could produce defensiveness. They may think that even though it may be something they do need, they might think, oh, this person's trying to assume what I need. And that can lead people to become defensive. A great timeout might be Hufflepuff, if you're a Harry Potter fan. Just a fun thing to say. We oftentimes associate Hufflepuffs with being very funny and warm. And sometimes, if the goal is to maintain the relationship, use team-oriented language when setting a timeout or approaching the conflict. It might help to say something like, could we create a timeout word for the disengagement? If this disagreement or conflict becomes too heated for both of us, I'm worried we might actually accidentally say something hurtful. Again, a way of saying what you might need during the conflict before even getting into it. If need be, it can help to set up a contract with your partner as an additional way to hold each other accountable, especially since we all have a lot of responsibilities, and it can be easy to forget things we agreed to previously when we're distressed. Also, it's really important to avoid a few different things when it comes to conflict. Substances that alter our mind or our mood can increase the likelihood of saying things we don't mean, forgetting what we previously agreed on for the conflict, or lead us to disengage in unhelpful ways. Caffeine can increase our anxiety, frustration, feelings of being overwhelmed. Allow yourself to cool down after consuming caffeine so you can enter the conflict from a more calm place. Avoid agreeing to confrontations on days you anticipate being busy or having other difficult tasks in conversations. Because if you're already drained of energy or feeling overwhelmed, you may be more susceptible to responding with anger, fear, or disengagement. Because maybe you're suffering from compassion fatigue and you just don't have maybe the patience or the empathy or compassion that day to have a conflict. And that's okay. Lastly, let's get into some relation longevity. How to get at these things in this healthy relationship wheel, how to continue applying a lot of what we talked about in emotion-focused communication, boundaries, and conflict resolutions. This is where we're going to get more into the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. So the 4 harbingers of the apocalypse are contempt, defensiveness, criticism, and stonewalling. To start with contempt, considering that as the biggest indicator of divorce, as you can see in the infographic here, it's the antidote to this is describing your own feelings and needs. So some things we've already talked about with emotion-focused communication. What contempt can look like is partner A might say to partner B, "You're so annoying," defining that person as some kind of unwanted, unhelpful, unattractive quality, maybe calling them ugly. It involves a power dynamic. It involves one or both people saying the other is lesser. And what that means is it creates a power differential in the relationship. It can lead one or both people in the relationship to feel worthless, because it involves demeaning the other person and amplifying any power imbalance that's already present. And again, it's because of that power differential expanding because of contempt. It's the most common predictor of the end of a relationship. The antidote is focusing on you, your needs, and your emotions, because it reduces the likelihood of demeaning the other person while still addressing your need or your complaint. As you can see in the 2 examples here, partner A calls partner B annoying because partner B spends a lot of time with them, which could be related to partner B's need for physical closeness. The second example involves partner A expressing the same complaint without identifying their partner as annoying. The partner is able to identify the behavior that is unhelpful for them by focusing on their needs and their emotions. They say, "I appreciate," and additionally, this process can open up a conversation around how to get each partner's needs met in the situation, specifically partner A's need to recharge maybe, and partner B's need for closeness. For the first example, doesn't provide much space for a conversation around the problem. It simply places blame on the other person and doesn't leave much space for conversation or disagreement. Another important part of this antidote is using appreciation and gratitude, which is applicable for all 4 horsemen. As you can see in this example, partner A could add things to the conversation that they appreciate about their partner, so that it creates that gentle startup that we talked about earlier and that you can see here. And it could look like something like, "I appreciate you for the excitement your excitement to spend time with me." Or it could sound like, "I feel really loved that you want to spend time with me," or that you desire to spend time with me. Your desire to spend time with me helps me feel loved by you. It can help you to express gratitude when your partner changes their behavior as well, such as, "Thank you so much for respecting my need to recharge. I love the way you're supporting me with this." The next harbinger of the apocalypse is criticism. So criticism is very similar to contempt, and it leads into contempt oftentimes, but it's attacking a person's character or their identity. The difference between it and contempt is that it doesn't identify the person specifically as that unwanted trait or lesser. In fact, as you will likely see in these examples here, it looks very similar to a complaint, so it can be hard to differentiate a complaint from a criticism. However, criticism oftentimes, again, attacks a character, whereas a complaint is a way of talking about a need that's not met. Criticism may start out like, why can't you ever clean the kitchen the right way? And might gradually evolve into, you never clean the kitchen, you're so disgusting. As you can see there, from criticism to contempt. The complaint might actually sound like, I don't like it when the kitchen is dirty. Not identifying a character flaw in the partner, just noticing that the kitchen is dirty and stating it. I don't like it or it might sound like, I don't like it when you leave dishes in the dishwasher. Complaints identify and describe the behavior of the problem, not the person or the character. Criticism blames and attacks the person engaging in the behavior that might not be helpful. The antidote for criticism is that gentle startup. It uses high language that I feel I need language, addresses your needs and your emotions that are impacted by your partner's behavior or lack thereof of their action. It reduces the likelihood of your partner becoming defensive or responding with criticism, because they are more likely to understand that the problem is the problem, not themselves. You might ask, but doesn't my behavior define me? To some degree, you're right. Our behaviors can define us, especially when we do the same or similar behaviors frequently and change very little about them. However, our behaviors are changeable, and doesn't it feel better to think, okay, my action is the problem in this situation? That's something I have control over and can change. And my partner doesn't see me as the problem, just maybe my behavior. Also, in many cases, it feels easier and more comfortable changing behavior as opposed to something about your identity. Another part of the antidote can be offering alternatives. So, as you can see here with this other example, the criticism is you always bring this up before we go somewhere. Again, attacking some unidentified characteristic of that person. The gentle startup might sound like, I'm feeling sad and frustrated having this argument before we go to the party. An additional antidote would be offering alternatives. Can we talk about this tomorrow? And maybe even specifying a specific time, so that is something that you come back to, validating the other person's need and emotion that they're experiencing, letting them know that maybe right now is not a great time, but I do want to talk to you about it because you're important to me. Or I can tell this is important to our relationship. Then we have defensiveness. Defensiveness, again, is a self-protection strategy that we naturally employ when we perceive that our character is under attack. It can be a counterattack to criticism or contempt, or a way to avoid spotlights on our actual or perceived flaws. In a sense, it's someone's way to cope with relational distress by saying, I'm not bad or flawed. Clearly, this is a you thing. The problem with defensiveness is that it escalates the disagreement by adding kindling to the fire, in a sense, of disruption in the relationship. It can result in criticism being fired back at the other partner, potentially leading to their defensiveness. This creates a negative feedback loop until one or both partners shut down, also known as stonewalling, which we'll get to in a moment, or it can lead to expressions of contempt, or simply it might leave both partners to leave the disagreement or actually disengage. The antidote for defensiveness is to take responsibility for the behavior. Then work with your partner to explore the problem with curiosity. Because again, the problem is the problem. Neither partner is the problem. As you can see in the examples here, the defensive reaction might be in response to that example that we talked about on the previous slide about dishes. Somebody might say, "Oh my God, you're so disgusting because you always leave the kitchen looking so dirty." Their defensive response is, maybe the dishes in the sink aren't a problem to me. I don't care why it bothers you so much. So this reflects the criticism onto partner A. This is clearly a you problem. I'm not worried about this, but you are. The antidote might be, "Oh, I'm sorry for not cleaning the dishes. I can tell this is important to you. Could you help me understand why that's a problem?" So it takes responsibility in the first sentence. Then you're validating your partner, validating that this is a concern for them, something that is distressing for them, and then attempts to understand, like, why. Why is it something that's very important to them? Why is it important to have a clean kitchen, no dishes in the sink? That last piece is really important, because if we attempt to understand our partner's point of view about why dirty dishes in the sink are a problem, or why whatever it is that they're complaining or criticizing about is a problem, it can help us learn more about our partners, about their values, about what maybe leads them to feel distressed, helps us create more empathy for them. Partner B the second partner expressing a need for understanding because they're having trouble seeing the problem or their partner's concern about dirty dishes. It's a very common problem. One thing I want to note here is, when you are prompting that curiosity approach with your partner, attempting to understand them, is you want to avoid the use of the word why. The reason for that is, in our linguistics, in our culture, and particularly in the English language, why is oftentimes a criticism word, or it's associated with criticism or accusing others. It can elevate conflict because it places pressure on the other person in the conversation. A more curious response is something like, "Could you help me understand why that's a problem?" You're still using the word why, but you're starting with that gentle startup of saying, like, "I don't understand what's going on or what exactly is going on, but I'm wanting to understand and why the problem's a problem. Not that you're a problem, not that you complaining about this is a problem, just why the problem is a problem." And lastly, we have stonewalling, which at its basic level is shutting down or mentally or even physically removing ourselves from the conflict. The goal of the behavior is to reduce our distress by avoiding anything that might amplify a sense of shame, disappointment, or other painful emotions. In fact, when the Gottmans conducted their research with couples, what they did was they used heart rate monitors to identify the stonewalling process. They found that as stonewalling partners' heart rates increased, it eventually reached a point where they would start to shut down, using disengagement statements like, "Whatever, I don't care," "Whatever, this isn't a problem to me," and then attempting to leave the space, or even just disengaging mentally in the space, having no eye contact, turning away, not responding. This suggests that the emotions and physical sensations that a person's having are so overwhelming that their body is trying to cope by disengaging from this painful experience. It's important to note that everyone has a different tolerance level for distress. So we might all stonewall, but some people might stonewall earlier than others. Another way to think of this is everyone has a different threshold for fight or flight modes. You might have heard of the fight or flight response to maintaining our safety when it comes to dangers in our environment. These thresholds for fight or flight are based on a complex series of factors, including our genetics, past experiences, situational factors like current workload or responsibilities, and the similar concept is applied with stonewalling. We have this complex series of different factors that influence this that we don't fully understand yet. If your partner seems to enter this threshold earlier than other partners, people, or yourself, then try to practice patience and empathy with them. I know it might be hard, but try to understand what the reaction might be about. For example, maybe the conversation is touching on a painful experience in past relationships where they felt rejected, or it led to the end of the relationship and they're worried about the relationship ending, so it feels safer to shut down. Because maybe that leads them to avoid saying something that might lead to the end of the relationship. The antidote for stonewalling is to have an agreed upon timeout procedure and a coping plan. The timeout, again, is to allow each other to have space to calm down, to begin self-soothing, to implement a coping plan so that they can reduce their distress and no longer feel like stonewalling is needed to manage their distress in that situation. The coping plan is going to be important for both partners, actually, even if you're not stonewalling in that moment, because it helps both of you return to a calmer state that allowing you to feel hopefully more prepared for the elevated stress that the conversation might elicit when you both return to talking about it. Lastly, we have some resources here. So for some deeper dives into these concepts or expanding upon them, you can watch Susan Adler's video on 3 Steps to a Happier Relationship, Dr. Davila and her descriptions of skills for healthy romantic relationships, and Doctors Andrea and Jonathan Taylor Cummings and their 4 Habits of All Successful Relationships from their own research. These are all videos that you can find through the links here or through YouTube just by searching these titles. Lastly, here are a variety, certainly not comprehensive, but a variety of different literature resources, online articles or websites that you can review for other information about maintaining healthy relationships or addressing unhealthy aspects of relationships. And here's a variety of different podcasts as well that address a variety of different types of relationships, how to maintain healthy relationships, and different ways to practice healthy consensual sex or to talk about sex with partners. Here's some other resources that you might be interested in, some more research-based resources, but I just want to thank you for your time, and just remember that if you ever want to talk more about these kinds of topics, feel free to come to Student Counseling Services on Iowa State campus for additional support. Thank you.